Rural Nebraska, October 1962. While her classmates were worried about homecoming dances and football games, 16-year-old Ruth Anderson was spending every spare moment digging into the prairie behind her family's farmhouse, creating something that her neighbors considered either pointless or insane, depending on how generous they felt when discussing the Anderson girls' latest project. Ruth's 11-year-old sister Miriam had severe asthma that turned every winter into a months-long struggle for breath. The dry, heated air of their farmhouse triggering attacks that sometimes sent her to the hospital 40 miles away. The cold outside air even worse when she had to venture out for any reason. Their parents had tried everything the doctors suggested: humidifiers that broke down constantly, medications that helped but never solved the problem, restrictions on activity that made Miriam miserable without making her healthy. Ruth had watched her sister suffer through 5 winters and had decided that if the adults couldn't find a solution, she would find one herself. The hole she was digging wasn't just a hole. It was the beginning of an underground room where the temperature and humidity would stay constant year-round, where Miriam could breathe easily even in the worst of winter, where the earth itself would provide what no machine or medicine had managed to deliver. If you want to find out what happened when the worst blizzard in 20 years trapped the Anderson family and half their neighbors in a hole that everyone had called crazy, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Ruth built that autumn saved far more than just her sister. The Anderson family had farmed the same land for 3 generations, wheat and corn and soybeans rotating through fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Ruth's great-grandfather had claimed the homestead in 1889, had built the original farmhouse that still formed the core of their home, despite decades of additions and modifications, had established the family in a community where everyone knew everyone and had for longer than most could remember. Her grandfather had expanded the operation, adding acreage during the difficult years when neighbors failed and sold out, building the farm into one of the largest in the county. Her father, Eric Anderson, had inherited both the land and the expectation that he would pass it on to the next generation in better condition than he had received it. Eric was a good farmer and a good father, practical and hardworking, devoted to his wife Linda and their 2 daughters in the quiet way that farming men often showed love, through provision and protection, rather than words and demonstrations. Ruth was the elder daughter, born responsible in the way that firstborn children often are, taking on tasks without being asked, watching out for her younger sister with a protective instinct that had only grown stronger as Miriam's health problems had become apparent. Miriam had been a healthy baby and a healthy toddler, showing no signs of the condition that would come to define so much of her childhood. The asthma had appeared suddenly when she was 6 years old, triggered by a respiratory infection that had seemed minor at first, but had left her lungs permanently sensitive to irritants that other people barely noticed. Dust, cold air, dry air, wood smoke, strong emotions, physical exertion. Any of these could trigger an attack that left Miriam gasping for breath, her lips turning blue, her parents frantically administering medication while debating whether this episode was serious enough to justify the long drive to the hospital. The attacks were terrifying to witness, and Ruth had witnessed dozens of them over the 5 years since her sister's diagnosis. She had learned to recognize the early warning signs, the slight wheeze that preceded serious difficulty, the way Miriam would unconsciously hunch her shoulders when breathing became labored. She had learned to stay calm during attacks, to help administer medication, to comfort her sister through episodes that must have felt like drowning in air that refused to provide what her body needed. Winter was always the worst season, the combination of factors creating conditions that seemed designed to trigger Miriam's symptoms. The wood stove and furnace that heated the farmhouse dried the air to levels that irritated sensitive airways. Opening windows for fresh air was impossible when temperatures dropped below zero. The cold air outside was even worse than the dry air inside, triggering immediate bronchospasm if Miriam tried to venture out without extensive precautions. For 5 months of each year, Miriam was essentially trapped, confined to a house that made her sick while the world outside threatened worse. She missed weeks of school, falling behind despite being naturally bright and motivated. She missed activities that other children took for granted, sledding and snowball fights, and the simple pleasure of running through fresh snow. She missed being normal, and Ruth watched her sister's joy diminish each winter as the reality of her limitations pressed down with the weight of all that accumulated snow. The idea had come to Ruth during a geography lesson about cave systems, when her teacher had mentioned that caves maintained constant temperatures year-round, regardless of surface conditions. The concept had lodged in her mind and connected with observations she had made over years of living on a farm. The root cellar beneath their house stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, its underground location protecting it from the temperature extremes that made surface buildings uncomfortable. The old well house that her great-grandfather had built into a hillside maintained humidity levels that kept the wooden structure from drying out even during the driest months. The earth itself was a buffer against extremes, a massive thermal regulator that could provide conditions very different from the air above it. Ruth had begun researching, using the school library and the public library in town, and eventually writing letters to university extension services, asking questions that must have seemed strange coming from a teenage girl in rural Nebraska. What temperature did the earth maintain at different depths? What humidity levels existed underground? How did people in other times and places use underground spaces for health purposes? The answers she received were encouraging. Underground temperatures in Nebraska stabilized at around 55 degrees just a few feet below the surface, regardless of whether the surface was baking at 100 degrees in summer or frozen at 20 below in winter. Humidity underground was naturally moderate, neither too dry nor too wet, the soil itself regulating moisture levels through absorption and release. Cultures throughout history had used underground spaces for health purposes, from the sanatoriums built into caves in European salt mines to the underground homes that people in extreme climates had constructed for thermal comfort. Ruth had found accounts of people with respiratory conditions improving dramatically when they spent time in underground environments, the stable temperature and humidity reducing the irritation that triggered their symptoms. The evidence suggested that an underground room might provide exactly what Miriam needed, a refuge where she could breathe easily during the winter months when the above-ground world became hostile to her lungs. Ruth had approached her parents with the idea in late summer, presenting her research with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did. Eric and Linda had listened with the skeptical attention of parents who had already tried so many things that had not worked, who had spent so much money on treatments that had not delivered what they promised. But Ruth's research was compelling, and her determination was obvious, and they found themselves agreeing to let her try despite their doubts. The underground room would be built behind the house, accessible through a short passage from the basement, positioned where it would not interfere with farming operations or future construction. Eric would help with the heavy excavation work on weekends, but Ruth would be responsible for the planning and finish work, her project to complete as she saw fit. If it worked, Miriam would have a refuge. If it failed, they would have an unusual root cellar that could store vegetables through the winter. The digging began in early September. Ruth working every afternoon after school, and all day on Saturdays, her father joining when his farm work permitted. The soil was easier to work than Ruth had feared, the prairie earth yielding to shovel and pickaxe with reasonable effort, the walls stable enough to stand without immediate reinforcement. She excavated a space roughly 12 feet square and 8 feet deep, large enough for comfortable occupation, but small enough to complete before winter arrived. The walls she reinforced with salvaged lumber and stones gathered from the fields, creating a structure that would support the earth above without risk of collapse. The ceiling was the most challenging element, requiring beams strong enough to hold the weight of several feet of soil that would provide insulation and thermal mass. Eric helped with this part, his construction experience ensuring that the overhead structure was safe and would last for decades. The entrance passage connected to the farmhouse basement through a doorway Ruth cut through the foundation wall, a modification that Eric supervised carefully to ensure it would not compromise the structure of the house. The passage itself was only 15 feet long, sloping gently downward to the underground room, lined with wooden planks to prevent soil from falling onto anyone using it. A proper door sealed the entrance, keeping the underground environment separate from the basement while allowing easy access. Ventilation came through a pipe that rose to the surface, positioned to draw fresh air without significantly affecting the temperature or humidity of the underground space. Ruth had calculated the size of the pipe carefully, large enough to provide adequate air exchange, but small enough to maintain the stable conditions that were the whole point of the project. By early November, the basic construction was complete, and Ruth began the process of making the underground room comfortable for her sister. She brought down furniture from storage, a small bed and a comfortable chair, and a table where Miriam could do homework or draw or read. She installed oil lamps in wall niches for lighting, their flames burning cleanly enough that they did not irritate sensitive airways. She added shelves for books and games and the various items that would make the space feel like a room rather than a hole in the ground. She hung fabric on the walls to soften the appearance and absorb sound that might otherwise echo strangely in the enclosed space. The floor she covered with rugs that added warmth and comfort underfoot. By the time she was finished, the underground room looked almost cozy, a small but pleasant space that happened to exist 8 feet below the surface of the Nebraska prairie. The first test came in mid-November, when a cold snap dropped temperatures to near zero, and the farmhouse heating system responded by drying the air to levels that made Miriam start to wheeze within hours. Ruth led her sister down the passage to the underground room, watching anxiously as Miriam settled into the comfortable chair and began breathing the air that Ruth had worked so hard to provide. The effect was not immediate, but it was clear. Within an hour, Miriam's breathing had eased noticeably, the wheeze fading, the tension leaving her shoulders as her lungs stopped fighting against the air they were trying to process. She stayed in the underground room for 3 hours that first day, emerging with a smile that Ruth had not seen since the previous spring. "I can breathe down there," Miriam said, as if reporting a miracle. "I can really breathe." The pattern established itself over the following weeks as winter settled onto the Nebraska prairie. When conditions in the farmhouse became difficult, when the dry, heated air started triggering symptoms, Miriam would retreat to the underground room where the stable temperature and humidity provided relief. She did homework there, read books there, sometimes slept there when nights were particularly bad. The attacks that had sent her to the hospital in previous years did not occur, her symptoms managed by access to an environment that did not constantly assault her sensitive airways. Ruth monitored conditions obsessively, checking temperature and humidity with instruments she had acquired through her research contacts, adjusting ventilation and other factors to maintain optimal conditions. The underground room was not a cure for Miriam's asthma. Nothing was a cure. But it was management that actually worked. A refuge that made winter survivable rather than torturous. Word spread through the community, as word always did in small rural areas, that the Anderson girl had built some kind of underground room for her sick sister. Reactions varied from curiosity to skepticism to the gentle mockery that farming communities often directed at projects that seemed impractical or strange. Some neighbors stopped by to see what Ruth had built, examining the underground room with the evaluating eyes of people who had constructed many things themselves and could recognize quality work when they saw it. Most left impressed despite their initial skepticism, acknowledging that the space was well built, even if they remained uncertain about its purpose. A few dismissed the whole project as foolishness, the kind of thing that happened when parents indulged children's ridiculous ideas instead of directing them toward useful work. Ruth ignored the criticism, focusing on her sister's improved health rather than the opinions of people who had never watched someone they loved struggle to breathe. December brought increasingly harsh weather, temperatures dropping lower and staying down longer, snow accumulating in drifts that made travel difficult and sometimes impossible. The underground room proved its value repeatedly, Miriam retreating there whenever conditions above ground became problematic, emerging hours later with the easy breathing that had been impossible during previous winters. The attacks that had characterized every previous December simply did not happen, prevented by access to an environment that did not trigger them. Ruth's parents, who had agreed to the project with significant reservations, found themselves acknowledging that their daughter had succeeded where doctors and medications had fallen short. The underground room was strange, was unusual, was unlike anything anyone else in the county had built, but it worked. And in the end, that was what mattered. The blizzard arrived on January 14th, 1963, announced by weather reports that warned of dangerous conditions, but that failed to convey the actual severity of what was coming. The storm system that descended on Nebraska that week was one of the worst in living memory, combining heavy snowfall with high winds and temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero with wind chill. Visibility fell to near zero within hours of the storm's arrival, the wind-driven snow creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see from the farmhouse to the barn just 100 feet away. The power failed on the first night, lines brought down by ice and wind, leaving the Anderson family dependent on their wood stove and kerosene lamps for heat and light. The situation became critical on the second day, when the farmhouse temperature began dropping despite continuous firing of the wood stove. The wind found every gap in the old structure, driving cold air into spaces that had seemed adequately sealed, stealing heat faster than the stove could replace it. By evening, the interior temperature had fallen to 50 degrees and was still dropping. Eric estimated that they had enough firewood inside to last perhaps another day if they burned it continuously, but the wood pile outside was unreachable through the storm, and the temperature inside would drop to dangerous levels long before the blizzard was expected to end. The family faced a genuine emergency, the kind that killed people on isolated farms when conditions exceeded what their preparations could handle. Ruth suggested the obvious solution, the one that had been waiting since she had started digging in September. The underground room maintained a constant 55 degrees regardless of surface conditions. It was small, but it was warm, and it was accessible through the basement passage without any exposure to the killing storm outside. The family could shelter there until the blizzard passed. Uncomfortable perhaps, but safe. Their survival assured by a hole in the ground that everyone had called foolish just weeks earlier. Eric and Linda agreed immediately, recognizing that their daughter's strange project had become their best option for survival. They gathered supplies, food, water, blankets, the kerosene lamps, medications for Miriam, and made their way down the basement stairs and through the passage to the underground room that Ruth had built for her sister. The space that had seemed adequate for one person was crowded with 4, but crowded was better than frozen, and the Anderson family settled in for what they hoped would be a brief stay, but feared might extend for days. The temperature was remarkably stable, the 55 degrees that Ruth had measured all fall, holding steady despite the apocalyptic conditions above them. The air was breathable, the ventilation pipe providing fresh air without admitting the deadly cold that would have quickly overwhelmed any above-ground shelter. They had light from the kerosene lamps, food enough for several days, water that would not freeze in the moderate underground temperature. They were uncomfortable, but they were safe. And safety was all that mattered when the alternative was freezing to death in a farmhouse that could not maintain survivable temperatures. They were not alone for long. On the second day of their underground shelter, a pounding on the basement door above announced the arrival of their nearest neighbors, the Gustafson family, who had made the desperate trek from their own failing farmhouse through a brief lull in the storm's intensity. Carl and Anna Gustafson had 3 children ranging from 7 to 14, and their older farmhouse had been losing the battle against the cold even faster than the Anderson home. They had faced the choice between staying and freezing, or trying to reach neighbors who might have better shelter. They had chosen to try, and they had succeeded, arriving at the Anderson farm nearly frozen but alive. Ruth led them down to the underground room without hesitation, the space becoming more crowded but the alternative, turning away freezing neighbors, being unthinkable. More arrivals followed over the next 2 days as the blizzard continued its assault on the Nebraska prairie. The Hendrickson family from a mile north, whose furnace had failed completely. Old Mrs. Patterson, who lived alone and whose small house had become a death trap as temperatures inside dropped toward 0. The Kowalski family with their new baby, terrified that the infant would not survive the cold that had overwhelmed their inadequate heating system. Each group had made the dangerous trek through brief breaks in the storm's intensity, guided by word that had somehow spread through the community that the Anderson place had shelter, real shelter, something that could keep people alive when everything else was failing. Ruth's underground room, built for one girl with breathing problems, became a refuge for 17 people over the worst 4 days of the worst blizzard in 20 years. The logistics of housing 17 people in a space designed for 1 or 2 would have been comical under less serious circumstances. There was no privacy, no comfort, barely enough room for everyone to sit at the same time, let alone lie down to sleep. They organized shifts for sleeping, some people resting while others sat, rotating through the limited floor space in a choreography that developed spontaneously from necessity. Food was rationed carefully. The supplies that would have lasted the Anderson family for a week stretched to feed 17 people for 4 days. Water was managed even more carefully. The jugs they had brought supplemented by melting snow that people brought down in buckets during the brief moments when the basement door could be opened safely. The children adapted more easily than the adults, treating the crowded underground space as an adventure rather than an emergency. They played games in the limited space, told stories to pass the time, formed friendships with children from other families they had known only casually before being thrown together in survival circumstances. The Gustafson children and the Hendrickson children discovered shared interests they had never known about, their forced proximity creating connections that would last long after the blizzard had passed. Baby Kowalski, too young to understand the danger, slept peacefully through most of the ordeal, his mother maintaining the feeding and changing routines that were possible even in such confined quarters. The adults faced greater challenges in maintaining morale and managing the stress of the situation. Carl Gustafsson and Eric Anderson took responsibility for monitoring conditions outside, making brief forays into the basement to check on the storm's progress and ensure that the passage to the underground room remained clear. Anna Gustafsson and Linda Anderson organized the food distribution and sleeping arrangements, their practical competence creating order from what could easily have become chaos. Old Mrs. Patterson, despite being the most vulnerable person in the shelter, proved surprisingly resilient, entertaining the children with stories from her youth and maintaining the calm demeanor that helped keep anxiety from spreading through the crowded space. Ruth found herself transformed from a 16-year-old girl into some kind of leader, her knowledge of the underground space and its capabilities making her the authority on questions that affected everyone's survival. The temperature in the underground room rose gradually as more bodies packed into the small space, climbing from 55 to 65 degrees as human heat accumulated faster than the earth could absorb it. The warmer temperature was actually welcome, making the crowded conditions more comfortable. The combined body heat of 17 people, creating an environment that felt almost cozy, despite the emergency circumstances. The air quality remained good, the ventilation system Ruth had designed proving adequate, even for a crowd many times larger than she had anticipated. Miriam, whose needs had inspired the entire project, found herself breathing more easily than she had during any previous winter, the combination of stable temperature and moderate humidity providing exactly what her lungs required. The storm finally broke on the morning of the 5th day, temperatures rising from impossible to merely brutal, the wind dropping enough to allow visibility and movement. The refugees emerged from their underground shelter blinking in the bright sunlight reflecting off endless fields of snow. Their cramped and uncomfortable confinement immediately transformed into a memory they would carry for the rest of their lives. Every person in that shelter had survived, from 3-month-old baby Kowalski to 73-year-old Mrs. Patterson, saved by a hole in the ground that a 16-year-old girl had dug because she wanted to help her sister breathe. The aftermath brought recognition that Ruth had neither sought nor expected. The story of the underground shelter spread through the region with the speed of remarkable tales, reaching newspapers that wrote features about the teenage girl whose strange project had saved 17 lives. County officials visited to document what Ruth had built, recognizing that her design might serve as a model for emergency shelters throughout the region. The State Emergency Management Office requested detailed plans of her construction, interested in promoting similar shelters for farms and rural homes that were vulnerable to the extreme weather that periodically struck the Great Plains. Ruth found herself interviewed by reporters, photographed for articles, held up as an example of the kind of practical ingenuity that people like to believe defined rural American character. She appeared on a local television program, awkwardly answering questions about her motivations while her parents beamed with pride from the studio audience. She received letters from people throughout the Midwest, some congratulating her on her achievement, others asking for advice about building similar shelters on their own properties. The attention was overwhelming for a girl who had simply wanted to help her sister breathe, but she handled it with the same practical determination she had brought to digging the hole in the first place. She was uncomfortable with the attention, deflecting credit to her parents for supporting her project, and to the neighbors who had shown the courage to make dangerous treks through the storm to reach shelter. But the recognition persisted, the community understanding that Ruth had done something remarkable, even if she preferred not to discuss it. The underground room remained in use for years afterward, serving its original purpose of providing Miriam with a refuge during difficult winters, while also becoming a community resource for emergency shelter during severe weather. Ruth expanded and improved it over time, adding space and amenities that made it more comfortable for extended occupation. Other families in the area built similar shelters after seeing what the Anderson Project could accomplish. The blizzard of 1963, having demonstrated the value of underground refuge in ways that no amount of theoretical argument could have achieved. The technique spread through agricultural extension services and emergency preparedness publications. Ruth's original design adapted and improved by engineers who recognized its potential for saving lives in extreme weather conditions. Miriam's health continued to improve as she grew older, her asthma becoming less severe as her lungs matured and she learned to manage triggers more effectively. She attended college, became a teacher, married a man who understood that her health required certain accommodations and was happy to provide them. She always credited her sister with giving her a childhood that would otherwise have been dominated by illness, with creating a space where she could breathe freely when the world above ground became hostile to her lungs. The bond between the sisters, forged through years of Ruth's protective care and strengthened by the Underground Room Project, remained central to both their lives long after they had established their own families and their own homes. Ruth graduated from high school in 1964 and surprised no one by pursuing education in engineering, her practical abilities finally receiving formal training that would allow her to apply them more broadly. She specialized in environmental systems, the design of spaces that maintained specific conditions for specific purposes, her childhood project with the underground room having revealed a calling she had not previously recognized. She worked on projects ranging from hospital ventilation systems to emergency shelters, bringing to each one the practical mindset that had led her to dig a hole in the Nebraska prairie because her sister needed to breathe. The lesson of Ruth Anderson's story extends beyond emergency preparedness or underground construction or any specific technique that might be replicated elsewhere. It speaks to the power of love expressed through action, of seeing a problem that affects someone you care about and refusing to accept that nothing can be done. Ruth could not cure her sister's asthma, could not change the fundamental sensitivity of Miriam's lungs, could not eliminate the winter conditions that made every year a struggle. But she could create a space where those conditions did not apply, where the stable temperature and humidity of the underground environment provided what no medication or machine had managed to deliver. She could dig a hole in the ground because she loved her sister, and because doing something was better than accepting that nothing could be done. So here's the question for you. What problems in the lives of people you love have you accepted as unsolvable, as simply the way things are? What actions might you take that could provide relief even if they cannot provide cure? What strange projects might you undertake, projects that others might call foolish or impractical, if you believed they might help someone you care about? Ruth Anderson was 16 years old when she started digging a hole to help her sister breathe. She did not know that her project would eventually save 17 lives during a blizzard that could have killed them all. She only knew that her sister struggled every winter and that she had found research suggesting an underground room might help. She dug the hole because it was something she could do, because action was better than acceptance, because love expressed through effort is the most powerful force that ordinary people possess. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about problems that might have solutions hiding in unexpected places, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things by refusing to accept limitations that everyone else took for granted. Because sometimes the answer to an impossible problem is as simple as digging a hole in the ground and seeing what happens when you refuse to give up on someone you love.